You're 40,000 years old, lying in the dark of a Romanian cave, and the last thing anyone will ever know about you is your jaw. No name, no face, no story, just bone, waiting 40,000 years for someone to ask the right question. In 2002, cavers found that jaw. In 2015, scientists finally sequenced its DNA, and what they found had never turned up in a human before or since. Most people alive today with roots outside Africa carry 1 to 3% Neanderthal DNA. This man carried 6 to 9%. That's not some faint ancient echo. Scientists traced it back to a Neanderthal ancestor just 4 to 6 generations back, a great-great-great-grandparent. He is the most Neanderthal human ever found, out of every ancient genome scientists have ever sequenced. And strangely, his lineage didn't pass substantially into the rest of us. His branch of the family tree quietly went nowhere. This is the story of that jawbone, and how one human being carried more of an extinct species inside him than anyone who has ever lived, before or since. The jaw came out of a place called Peștera cu Oase, the Cave of Bones, tucked into the mountains of southwestern Romania. Cavers found it in 2002, along with a partial skull. No tools, no fire pits, no signs anyone had lived there. Just bones, likely washed in by an underground river and sealed away for tens of thousands of years. At first, it was just old. Radiocarbon dating put the jaw at somewhere between 37,000 and 42,000 years old, making it one of the earliest known modern humans in Europe, arriving right around the time our species and Neanderthals briefly shared the same continent. For over a decade, that's all anyone knew. A very old jaw in a very old cave, from a very brief window in history. Then, in 2015, DNA sequencing caught up to what the bone had been hiding the entire time. A team led by geneticist Qiaomei Fu, working with researchers from Harvard and the Max Planck Institute, managed to extract and sequence usable DNA from the jaw. No small feat from a specimen that old and that degraded. What they found made headlines. Nearly everyone alive today whose ancestry traces outside sub-Saharan Africa carries a small trace of Neanderthal DNA, typically 1 to 3%, a leftover from interbreeding that happened tens of thousands of years ago. It's a real part of you, but a faint one, worn down by hundreds of generations of shuffling genetics. The Oase man had 6 to 9%. That's not a trace, that's a legacy. And the reason scientists could tell it was recent wasn't just the percentage, it was the shape of the DNA itself. Neanderthal DNA breaks into smaller and smaller fragments with each new generation, like a photocopy of a photocopy getting blurrier each time. The segments in the Oase man's genome were still long and intact. Based on how large they were, researchers calculated he'd had a Neanderthal ancestor just 4 to 6 generations back. In other words, somewhere in this man's immediate family tree, not that many generations before he was born, one of his relatives had a Neanderthal parent, grandparent, or great-grandparent. This wasn't ancient history to him, it was recent family gossip. Here's where it gets interesting, because he wasn't the only early European with a surprisingly recent Neanderthal relative. In 2021, researchers studying roughly 35,000-year-old remains from Bășochiro Cave in Bulgaria found something similar. People whose ancestors had also interbred with Neanderthals just a handful of generations earlier. But even compared to Bășochiro, the Oase man stands apart. Where the Bășochiro individuals carried around 3 to 3.8% Neanderthal DNA, the Oase man carried roughly double that. Even in a small cluster of already rare, recently mixed ancient humans, he was the outlier of the outliers, the rarest of the rare. Which raises the obvious question, why him? Why did his family history end up so unusually tangled with Neanderthals, when most of his contemporaries didn't? The honest answer is scientists don't fully know. It might mean interbreeding between the two groups happened more than once, in more places than we used to think. That these encounters weren't a single rare event in the Middle East, but something that kept happening in pockets as modern humans pushed into Neanderthal territory across Europe. Now here's the part that makes this story stranger, not simpler. You might expect that a man carrying this much Neanderthal DNA would have passed a good chunk of it down to us, that somewhere in your own genome, if your ancestry traces to Europe, a little piece of the Oase man might be sitting there today. He didn't. When researchers compared his genome to present-day Europeans and Asians, they found no meaningful sign that his population contributed to either group going forward. His lineage, despite existing right at the moment modern humans and Neanderthals were mixing, simply didn't continue. His branch of the family tree quietly ran out. This isn't unique to him either. Other early European genomes from this same window, like the Zlatý Kun skull from the Czech Republic, among the oldest modern human genomes ever sequenced, show the same pattern. Early pioneering populations in Europe that appeared left behind a few bones and one very strange genetic story, and then vanished without leaving descendants we can trace today. Which means the Oase man wasn't just rare in how much Neanderthal DNA he carried, he was rare in a second way too. He's a genetic dead end, a one-time event recorded once in one jawbone that will never be repeated and will never show up in anyone alive today. So what do we actually have at the end of all this? One jawbone, one river cave, one brief genetic accident that happened somewhere in Europe roughly 40,000 years ago between a human and a Neanderthal that produced a lineage that existed for a handful of generations and then disappeared completely. No one alive carries his exact story. No one ever will again. The moment that made him is gone. The same way Neanderthals themselves are gone. But somewhere in the deep background of your own DNA, if your ancestry traces outside Africa, there's a much smaller, quieter version of the same story. A different encounter, a different lineage, thousands of generations removed that did survive, and did make it all the way down to you. The Oase man is proof that these encounters happened. You are proof that sometimes they lasted.